She was humiliated for inheriting 13 acres of rock in the canyon until the valley dried up and changed everything. Sarah Miller never imagined that plain manila envelope would change her life so cruelly. The summons to read Uncle Silas's will arrived on a rainy Tuesday, and she attended the lawyer's office with low expectations. When Mr. Foster began reading the uncle's last wishes, the silence in the room was heavy. The wealthy cousins sat in the leather chairs with anxious expressions. Sarah occupied a simple chair in the corner, trying to go unnoticed. The lawyer adjusted his glasses and announced the first inheritances. To Sterling, the eldest son of the uncle's sister, went the fertile lands near the river. To Victoria, the farm with the big house and orchard. For each cousin, a valuable property in the lush valley. Then the lawyer paused, looked directly at Sarah, and said that to her went 13 acres of land high up in the canyon. The room erupted in laughter. Sterling slapped the table, guffawing loudly. Victoria covered her mouth with her hand, but her eyes sparkled with cruel amusement. Sarah's sister-in-law, Brenda, commented loudly that not even cacti grew on those cursed rocks. The laughter echoed off the office walls as Sarah felt her face burn with humiliation. She clutched the property deed between trembling fingers, wanting to disappear. Uncle Silas had been the only person in the family who had always believed in her. When everyone said she'd never be anything more than a substitute teacher earning peanuts, he defended her. When her father called her a useless dreamer, Uncle Silas would sit with her on the porch and say a person's true worth was in places ordinary eyes couldn't see. Now he was gone, and that inheritance felt like a bad joke. Leaving the office, Sarah had to pass between cousins who were still laughing in the hallways. Sterling grabbed her arm and asked if she was going to plant rocks. Victoria suggested she sell it to him right away for any price, before she realized it wasn't even worth the paper it was printed on. Sarah pulled free and ran to the parking lot, holding back tears until she was inside the old car that barely ran. She drove through the streets of the small town in the Ozarks with no particular destination. People on the sidewalks watched her pass, and she was sure they already knew about the humiliation. News traveled fast in small places. She stopped in front of the simple house where she lived alone, an old building with leaks in the walls and faucets that dripped non-stop. The rent consumed half of the irregular salary she earned, substituting at different schools each week. Inside the house, Sarah spread old maps on the kitchen table. She searched for the canyon, trying to understand what her uncle had left her. The coordinates pointed to a rugged region 40 kilometers away, a place she had visited only once in childhood. She vaguely remembered black rocks, scalding sun, and a feeling of absolute emptiness. Nothing grew there. There were no proper roads. It was a piece of land forgotten by God and man. The next morning, she woke with the certainty that she needed to see that place. She packed a backpack with water, sandwiches, and an old hat. The road to the canyon was worse than she imagined. The dirt road had deep potholes that nearly tore the wheels off the car. After 2 hours of jolting, she had to abandon the vehicle and continue on foot up a steep trail. The midday sun turned every stone into a hot coal. Sarah climbed slowly, stopping often to catch her breath. There was no shade, no relief. When she finally reached the top and saw the expanse of the inherited land, she felt her heart tighten. It was just dark rocks, some strange formations that looked wind-carved, and yellowed scrub brush. The silence was so deep, it hurt her ears. She sat on a smooth rock and looked toward the horizon. Down below, she could see the green valley where her cousins' farms were. She saw the river winding through the crops, the large houses with red roofs, the tidy corrals. That was the world that could have been hers if her uncle had truly loved her. But there she was, sitting atop useless rocks, heir to the part nobody wanted. She cried alone for the first time since her uncle had passed 3 weeks ago. The tears fell hot onto the hot stones, drying almost instantly. She thought about how cruel life had been. At 32, she had no husband, no children, no established career. She lived on odd jobs in education, slept in a house that wasn't hers, drove a car that could break down at any moment. And now she had 13 acres of nothing. She returned to town in the late afternoon, physically and emotionally exhausted. On the way, She stopped at Martha's general store to buy bread. The shopkeeper greeted her with a fake smile, asking if she had started planting diamonds on her new land yet. Other customers laughed at the joke. Sarah took the bread and left without responding, feeling their stares boring into her back. In the following days, the situation worsened. At the school where she was temporarily substituting, Principal Eleanor called her in for a private conversation. The woman, in her 60s with grey hair pulled into a tight bun, closed the office door and asked if Sarah was emotionally well. She said people around town were commenting that she had refused sensible offers to sell that worthless land, which showed a lack of judgment. Sarah tried to explain that she was still processing the inheritance, that she needed time to decide. Principal Eleanor shook her head in disapproval and suggested she seek guidance, perhaps from a psychologist. The words were spoken with false kindness, but the implication was clear. Sarah was being seen as unstable. In the teacher's lounge, conversations stopped when she entered. Her colleagues whispered in corners, casting curious glances. One afternoon, she heard the math teacher commenting to another that Sarah's family was worried about her mental state, that the inheritance had messed with her head. Sarah pretended not to hear and graded papers in silence, her hands trembling with contained anger. At night, at home, she began to sift through her uncle's things she had kept. It wasn't much, just a cardboard box with a few belongings. She found yellowed photographs, a broken pocket watch, and a bundle of letters tied with string. The letters were old, written by her uncle's mother decades ago, but at the bottom of the box she discovered more recent envelopes addressed to her. She opened the first letter with trembling hands. It was dated 6 months before her uncle's passing. He wrote about the canyon lands, saying that place held a secret only time would reveal. He said he had chosen to leave that land to her because he saw in her something others didn't have, the ability to see beyond appearances. The letter ended with an enigmatic phrase, "The real treasure is hidden where nobody looks." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. Sarah reread the letter several times that night, trying to decipher its meaning. What secret could be hidden in barren rocks? What treasure was there in dry land? She opened the other letters from her uncle and found more mysterious messages. In one, he mentioned a rock formation shaped like a cross. In another, he spoke of patience and observation. In the last letter, written a week before passing, her uncle asked her not to give up on the land, no matter what the family said. The next morning, Sarah woke with renewed determination. She would return to the canyon and search for that cross-shaped formation. She packed a larger backpack with more water, food for the entire day, and a notebook for taking notes. She informed the school she couldn't work that day for personal reasons. The secretary noted it with a disapproving expression. The trip to the canyon was equally difficult the second time. The car barely made it up the last steep hill. Sarah left the vehicle in the same spot as before and continued on foot. This time she paid more attention to the details around her. She noticed that some hardy plants grew in specific cracks in the rocks. She saw erosion marks that formed interesting patterns. The place was beginning to reveal a strange, wild beauty she hadn't perceived before. She walked for hours searching for the cross formation. The sun beat down mercilessly, and she had to stop several times to drink water and rest in the scarce shade of some larger rocks. She was almost ready to give up when, rounding a rise, she saw the formation. 2 large rocks crossed at an almost perfect angle, creating a cross-shaped shadow on the ground. She approached with a racing heart. She examined the rocks from every angle, looking for any mark or inscription. Then she saw it discreetly carved into the lower stone, words almost erased by time. She had to wet the rock with water to read it better. The message said, "Water finds its way even when everyone believes it has vanished." Sarah wrote everything down in her notebook, but she didn't understand the meaning. What water? There were no springs in the canyon, no sign of moisture beyond the hardy plants. She spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the area around the rock formation, but found nothing but stones and more stones. She returned home frustrated, yet intrigued. Her uncle's words echoed in her mind. He wouldn't leave meaningless messages. There had to be something there she still wasn't seeing. She spent the night researching geology, water tables and rock formations. The more she read, the more she realized her own ignorance on the subject. Days turned into weeks. Sarah divided her time between temporary work at the school and visits to the canyon. With each trip, she brought more improvised equipment, ropes, flashlights, simple tools. She mapped the rock formations, noted where she saw green plants despite the heat. She was beginning to know that place in an intimate, almost personal way. Meanwhile, something worrying began to happen in the valley. The drought, which had already lasted several months, intensified. The river that had always been full began to visibly shrink. The shallow wells on the smaller farms dried up. The older farmers remarked they'd never seen anything like it. Mrs. Martha from the general store said it was divine punishment for some sin of the community. Sterling, the cousin who had inherited the lands near the river, began to grow worried. His corn and bean crops depended on constant irrigation. With the river dropping, pumping costs were rising. He called an emergency meeting with the other landowners in the valley to discuss solutions. Sarah learned of the meeting through comments she overheard at the bakery. She wasn't invited, naturally. She wasn't considered a real landowner, just the crazy woman clinging to useless rocks. But the news of the drought began to worry her for other reasons. If the situation worsened, how long would it be before they turned their eyes to her land in the canyon? The answer came faster than she imagined. One morning, her older brother Thomas appeared at her door. He was a robust man of 45, owner of a cattle ranch that was also suffering from the water shortage. He entered uninvited and sat heavily on the kitchen chair. Thomas Miller went straight to the point. He said the community needed to drill new wells to find water at deeper levels. The canyon lands were the ideal place to try, since they weren't good for anything else anyway. He offered Sarah $5,000 for the land, 3 times more than anyone would pay for it. He said he was being generous. Sarah felt something tighten in her chest. She looked at the brother who rarely visited, who had never cared to know if she was okay during the difficult years, and she refused the offer. Thomas blinked in surprise, as if he couldn't believe what he'd heard. He repeated the proposal, raising it to $7,000. Sarah kept shaking her head. Her brother lost his composure. He stood up abruptly, knocking over the chair. He shouted that she had always been stubborn and foolish, that she wouldn't recognize a good opportunity, even if it fell from the sky. He said Uncle Silas had made a mistake leaving anything to such a senseless person. He slammed the door so hard that a picture fell from the wall. Sarah stood still in the empty kitchen, trembling. Not from fear, but from anger. The family had always treated her as inferior, as someone who should be grateful for any crumb of attention. And now, when they needed something from her, they came with offers that seemed like favors. She would not give in. Not this time. The refusal angered not only Thomas but the entire family. Within a few days, Sarah became the official villain of the town. Malicious comments spread through the markets, beauty salons, bars. They said she was selfish, that she preferred to keep useless rocks while children suffered from thirst. That foolish pride blinded her to reality. At school, the situation became unbearable. Students repeated comments they heard from their parents. An 8-year-old girl asked why teacher Sarah didn't like children. A boy said his father had commented that she was mean. Principal Eleanor called her again, this time more serious. She suggested Sarah take a medical leave, that she was clearly going through a difficult time. Sarah knew what that meant. She was being fired in a veiled way. She gathered her belongings from the drawer, the few things she kept there. She said goodbye to the students with a lump in her throat and left that school for the last time. On the street, she had to hold back her tears until she got home. Without a job and without prospects, she began living off the few resources she had saved. She ate less, turned off the lights earlier, cut all possible expenses, and she kept visiting the canyon, increasingly obsessed with understanding the secret her uncle had mentioned. It was during one of these visits that she noticed something interesting. Even with the severe drought that turned the valley into a desert, some plants in the canyon remained surprisingly green. She approached one of them, a kind of robust fern growing in a deep crevice. She tried to pull the plant out to examine it better, but the roots were too firm. She dug around it with her hands, getting all dirty with earth and stones. The roots went down much deeper than she had imagined. She followed them with her fingers, widening the crevice. And then she felt it. Moisture. Deep at the bottom of the crevice, the earth was slightly damp. In the middle of the worst drought in decades, that earth hidden between rocks retained moisture. Sarah's heart raced. She returned the next day with better tools and dug deeper. The moisture increased. She tested other crevices nearby and found the same pattern. Something under those rocks retained water when everything else dried up. But what? And how much? She needed professional help, but had no money to hire a geologist. She then remembered a lecture she had attended years ago at the university in the neighboring town. A retired professor had spoken about the region's geological formations. She searched for his name in her old notebooks. Arthur Sterling, a geologist with over 40 years of experience. It took 2 days to find the professor's address. When she finally knocked on the door of the simple house on the outskirts of town, she was greeted by an elderly gentleman with white hair and eyes alive with curiosity. Arthur Sterling was 73 years old, but moved with the energy of someone much younger. Sarah explained her situation, the inherited land, the dampness she had found in the cracks. The professor listened attentively, asking precise questions. When she finished, he was silent for a moment, looking out the window with a thoughtful expression. Then he said he would visit the canyon the next day, driven purely by scientific curiosity. The visit changed everything. Arthur examined the rocks with equipment he had brought, measured slopes, collected soil samples from the cracks. He spent hours walking the land, frequently stopping to take notes. At the end of the day, he sat on a rock next to Sarah and shared his preliminary analysis. There was a high probability of a deep aquifer running beneath those rocks. The canyon's geological formation created a kind of natural underground basin. While the drought had dried up the river and the valley's shallow wells, that deep water remained untouched, fed by springs very far away. The cracks in the rocks allowed deep roots to reach that moisture. Sarah could hardly believe what she was hearing. She asked if he was sure if that was really possible. Arthur was honest. They were only indications, not proof. They would need further studies, expensive equipment, test drilling. But all the signs were there. That land that seemed completely barren could be sitting on a liquid fortune. The information was too powerful to share. Sarah thanked the professor and asked him to keep it secret for now. Arthur agreed, understanding the delicacy of the situation. He said he would return in a few days with more equipment borrowed from old university colleagues. That night, Sarah barely slept. Her mind buzzed with possibilities and fears. If there really was water under her land, it would change everything. But what if the family found out before she could protect her rights? What if they tried to take the land by force? She needed to be careful, very careful. Meanwhile, the drought in the valley worsened dramatically. The river that had always been the soul of the region was reduced to a thin trickle. Crops wilted under the relentless sun. Thomas's cattle began to go thirsty. The poorest families faced severe water rationing. The situation was becoming desperate. Mayor Harrison, a man of 60 with a prominent belly and a shrill voice, called an emergency assembly. The entire community gathered in the main church hall. Sarah went, sitting discreetly in the back. The mayor spoke about the severity of the crisis, the need for drastic measures. It was then that Thomas stood up and spoke. He said he had a solution: drill deep wells in the highlands of the canyon, where they had never tried before. Everyone knew that land belonged to his sister, Sarah, and everyone knew that she, for selfish reasons, refused to allow any productive use of that space. The crowd murmured in agreement. Her cousin Sterling joined the speech. He reminded everyone that that land produced nothing, was good for nothing. It was a waste to keep it unproductive while the valley died of thirst. He suggested the municipality could declare eminent domain and requisition the land for emergency drilling. The suggestion was met with applause. Sarah felt all eyes turn to her. The mayor called her by name, asking her to speak. With trembling legs, she stood up. She claimed that those lands were her legal property, left by her uncle, that she had rights guaranteed by law. The response was met with boos and indignant shouts. An elderly lady, Mrs. Hattie, rose with difficulty. She was over 80 and respected by everyone. She pointed a crooked finger in Sarah's direction and said she should be ashamed, that when she was a child, her family had helped Sarah and her mother in hard times, and now, when it was time to give back to the community, she chose selfishness. The words hurt more than anything else. Sarah left the meeting under stares of pure hatred. Some people spat on the ground as she passed. A group of young people followed her for a few blocks, shouting insults. She practically ran home, locked herself in and cried until she had no tears left. The next morning, she woke to the sound of breaking glass. A rock had come through the living room window, shattering glass across the floor. Attached to the projectile was a note, "Leave or you'll regret it." Sarah's hands trembled as she held the paper. For the first time, she felt real fear. She called her cousin Peggy, the only person in the family who still spoke to her occasionally. Peggy answered with a tense voice and said she couldn't help, that the entire family was united against Sarah this time, that she herself agreed Sarah was being unreasonable. She hung up before Sarah could respond. Isolated and scared, Sarah sought legal help. She visited 3 different lawyers, but all refused the case as soon as they heard her name. They had clients in the valley. They couldn't antagonize the whole community. The 4th lawyer she sought was a young recent graduate named Daniel Brooks, who worked in a tiny office in the back of a commercial building. Daniel was 26, with round glasses and a perpetually worried expression. He listened to Sarah's story with growing attention. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then he said he would take the case, but needed to be honest. The odds were complicated. If the municipality declared a state of water emergency, they could indeed requisition private land for drilling. Sarah would have at most 3 months before that happened legally. The young lawyer charged a symbolic fee, more out of professional integrity than a need for payment. He said the case intrigued him, that there was something deeply wrong in how Sarah was being treated. He immediately began studying the applicable legislation, looking for loopholes, looking for ways to protect her rights. Meanwhile, Sarah made a drastic decision. She sold her old car for a pittance and used the money to buy supplies. She set up an improvised camp in the canyon, determined to spend days there studying every inch of that land. If there was a secret to uncover, she needed to be quick. The first days camping were the hardest of her life. The nights were freezing, the wind biting. During the day, the sun turned the rocks into ovens. She ate little, rationed water, recorded everything meticulously in notebooks. She mapped every crevice, every green plant, every interesting rock formation. It was on the 3rd night that she heard it for the first time. She woke at 3 in the morning to a strange sound, a distant murmur, almost imperceptible. She got up from her sleeping bag and followed the sound. It came from a wide crevice she had explored during the day. She approached slowly, hardly believing what she heard. It was water, running water, deep within the rocks. She lay prone on the edge of the crevice and pressed her ear to the opening. The sound was unmistakable, water flowing somewhere deep in the earth. Sarah's heart beat so hard it hurt. Uncle Silas was right. He had always been right. There was water there, hidden, waiting. She spent the rest of the night awake, too excited to sleep. At dawn, she called Arthur Sterling from a payphone in the nearest town. She asked him to come urgently, that she had found something important. The professor said he would be there the next day with acoustic measurement equipment. The confirmation came 24 hours later. Arthur lowered his instruments into the fissure and listened carefully with professional headphones. After several measurements, he stood up with a smile on his wrinkled face. There was definitely an underground watercourse flowing there, probably an artesian aquifer fed by springs in distant mountains. The rock formation of the canyon created a natural barrier that protected that water, even during severe droughts. Sarah asked how much water could be there. Arthur was cautious with estimates, but said if the formation was as extensive as the preliminary data suggested, it could be enough to supply the entire region for decades. Those despised lands were, literally, a liquid gold mine. The news was both liberating and terrifying. Sarah now knew she had something of immense value. But so what? She didn't have the resources to drill, to create collection systems. And if the family found out, they would intensify their attacks. She needed a plan, and fast. She returned home determined to keep the secret absolute. But the small town had eyes everywhere. Someone had seen her talking with Professor Arthur. Comments began to circulate. What was that strange girl plotting with an old geologist? What mystery was in those rocks that justified so much effort? Thomas Miller heard the rumors and decided to investigate. He hired a man to discreetly follow Sarah. The man saw her go up to the canyon several times, camp there, spend entire days among the rocks. He reported everything to his boss. Thomas grew suspicious. Why would anyone spend so much time on useless land unless they knew something others didn't? The suspicion turned to paranoia when Thomas spoke with Sterling. The two cousins began to piece things together. Uncle Silas wasn't a fool. Why would he leave exactly those lands to Sarah? There must be a reason. Perhaps the old man knew something he never shared. Perhaps there was value in those rocks that no one perceived. They decided to act fast. Thomas had a friend who worked for a well drilling company in Chicago. He called him and explained the situation in a manipulative way. He said they needed to drill urgently in the highlands to save the community, but the owner was difficult. The friend suggested seeking an emergency court order, claiming public interest. With political connections and the desperate drought situation, they got what they wanted. A judge from the neighboring county, pressured by the mayor and the influential landowners of the valley, signed a temporary court order. It allowed exploratory drilling on the canyon lands for a period of 30 days, enough time to verify the feasibility of deep wells. Daniel Brooks, the young lawyer, called Sarah with the devastating news. She had only 2 weeks to contest the order before it became permanent. And contesting meant gathering evidence, hiring experts, facing experienced lawyers paid by the cousins. With what money? With what resources? Sarah fell into despair. She had missed work for weeks, had eaten so little she was visibly losing weight. The landlady of the house where she lived showed up demanding 2 months of overdue rent. She threatened eviction if she wasn't paid within 48 hours. Sarah didn't have the money. She had nothing but land that everyone wanted to take from her. Sitting on the floor of the empty living room that night, she considered giving up for the first time. Selling everything, taking whatever money they offered and leaving. Starting a new life in another town where no one knew her name or her humiliation. It would be so much easier to just disappear. But then she remembered Uncle Silas's face the last time they had spoken. He was in the hospital, already very weak. He held her hand and said he trusted her to protect something precious. At the time, Sarah thought he was referring to memories, to sentimental keepsakes. Now she understood. Her uncle had entrusted her with protecting that water, to not let greedy people waste it or control it. She got up from the floor with new determination. She called Arthur and asked if he would testify about the discovery of the water. The professor agreed immediately. He said more. He knew an environmental lawyer from Chicago who owed him favors. Perhaps he could help. In the following days, Sarah and Daniel Brooks worked frantically. They gathered all the data collected by Arthur, compiled photographs of the damp fissures, recorded the sound of running water. They put together a complete dossier showing evidence of a protected aquifer. The environmental lawyer from Chicago, a serious man named Julian Sterling, reviewed the material and agreed to join the case pro bono. They filed a technical challenge showing that improper drilling could contaminate or rupture the natural artesian aquifer. They requested an immediate suspension of the drilling until full environmental studies were completed. They argued that the public interest in preserving a natural water source outweighed the interest in hasty exploratory drilling. The challenge caused a stir. Thomas and Sterling did not expect organized resistance. They pressured the judge to deny the request, but Julian Sterling had impressive experience and credentials. The magistrate, uncomfortable with the complicated situation he had created, decided to schedule a hearing to hear both sides. The hearing was set for 10 days later. Enough time for the entire town to split into factions. On one side, those who supported Sarah and environmental preservation. On the other, those who wanted the drilling to start immediately to solve the water crisis. Discussions in the bars and markets grew increasingly heated. Sarah lived under constant tension. She had to move after her landlady evicted her. She slept on the couch in Daniel Brooks's office, who felt sorry for her. She ate when someone offered. She lost weight, had deep dark circles under her eyes, but she didn't give up. 3 days before the hearing, something happened that changed everything. The drought, already severe, worsened drastically. The river that still had a thin trickle dried up completely. For the first time in the region's recorded history, the riverbed was exposed. Stones that had never seen sunlight appeared. Fish rotted in the dry mud. Desperation in the valley reached critical levels. Families began rationing water for the basics, 1 glass per person per day. Children cried from thirst. Cattle died in the pastures. Crops turned to ash. The mayor tried to bring water trucks from neighboring towns, but the cost was prohibitive. The community was on the brink of collapse. It was in this moment of greatest tension that Sarah received an unexpected visit. Mrs. Hattie, the elderly lady who had harshly criticized her at the town meeting, appeared at the door of the office where she was taking refuge. The old woman came leaning on a cane, breathing heavily after climbing the stairs. They sat in silence for a moment. Mrs. Hattie looked at Sarah with tired eyes and apologized. She said she had spoken too harshly, influenced by fear and by others, that she had thought a lot in recent days and realized that Sarah might have reasons nobody understood. She asked in a soft voice if there really was water on that land. Sarah hesitated. She could lie, she could keep the secret, but she looked at Mrs. Hattie's wrinkled face, at the sincere eyes, and decided to trust. She told her everything. About her uncle's letters, about the signs of underground water, about the fear that hasty drilling would destroy a precious natural source. The old woman listened to it all in silence. When Sarah finished, Mrs. Hattie slowly shook her head. She said she believed her, that Uncle Silas was a wise man and would never do something without reason. She offered to testify at the hearing, to speak about Sarah's character and the need for caution. The offer moved Sarah deeply. It was the first time in months that someone from the community had openly supported her. They embraced, 2 women from different generations united by a common purpose. Mrs. Hattie left slowly, but with renewed determination. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now continuing. The news that Mrs. Hattie had changed sides caused ripples in the community. The lady was respected. Her opinion carried weight. Some people began to question the narrative that Sarah was simply selfish. Perhaps there was more to the story than met the eye. But Thomas and Sterling did not rest. Knowing that losing the hearing would mean losing access to the land, they intensified their campaign against Sarah. They spread rumors that she was hiding gold or precious stones on the land, that she intended to sell water at exorbitant prices while the valley died, that she was dangerous and manipulative. The drilling company, eager to begin the lucrative work, mobilized heavy equipment. Trucks with drilling platforms went up the precarious road toward the canyon 2 days before the hearing. When Sarah found out, she ran there to stop it. She arrived breathless at the top and found a scene that seemed straight out of a nightmare. 5 huge trucks, noisy machines, men in hard hats walking back and forth. The foreman, a big fellow named Caleb, saw her arrive and waved for her to stop. He said they had a court order to begin preparations. Sarah showed the legal objection, explained about the pending hearing. Caleb shrugged and said he had received orders from the company to start the work, that if she had legal problems, she should settle them with the lawyers. The men continued assembling the metal structures. In an act of desperation, Sarah physically placed herself in front of the largest machine. The workers stopped, confused. Caleb got down from the cab and ordered her to move. Sarah refused. She said that was her land, that they would have to literally go over her to drill. The scene attracted attention. Thomas arrived with Sterling and other landowners who had come up to watch the start of the drilling. They saw Sarah clinging to a rock, refusing to move. Thomas turned red with anger. He advanced toward his sister and tried to forcibly pull her from the spot. Sarah resisted. She held on with all her strength. Thomas yanked her arm violently. She cried out in pain but did not let go. Sterling joined his cousin. Together they tried to shove Sarah away. She fell to the ground, scraped her knees on the rocks but crawled back in front of the machine. Her sister-in-law Brenda, who had also come up, shouted that Sarah was making a scene, that she had always been dramatic, always sought attention. that she was shaming the entire family with that pathetic theatre. Other onlookers agreed loudly. Some laughed at the scene. That's when something unexpected happened. Mrs. Hattie appeared at the top of the canyon, leaning on her cane. She must have climbed up with someone's help, because the path was too difficult for a person her age. She positioned herself beside Sarah and said loudly and firmly that no one would touch that girl while she was there. The courageous gesture of a respected elder silenced the crowd for a moment. Thomas hesitated, clearly unsure how to act. He couldn't use physical force against Mrs. Hattie without looking like a complete monster. The situation froze in a tense standoff. It was at that moment that Arthur Sterling came running, or as close to running as a 73-year-old man could manage. He was out of breath, with a folder of documents under his arm. He shouted for everyone to stop. He said he had just received the final results of the analyses he had requested from a specialized lab. Everyone turned to the professor. Arthur opened the folder and began to read aloud. The analyses definitively confirmed the presence of a deep artesian aquifer beneath that land. More than that, they showed the geological formation was extremely delicate. Drilling without proper prior studies had a high probability of rupturing the impermeable layer that kept the water isolated and pure. The geologist explained in technical but understandable terms, if they drilled the wrong way, they could contaminate the groundwater with surface material. Or worse, they could rupture the aquifer's natural pressure, causing the water to leak into deep, inaccessible layers of earth. Instead of gaining access to the water, they could destroy the source completely. The workers from the drilling company grew restless. Caleb, the foreman, was no fool. He knew if something went wrong, the responsibility would fall on the company. He said he needed to contact his superiors before continuing. The other men agreed. The machines were shut down. Thomas Miller exploded in fury. He accused Arthur of being paid by Sarah to invent stories. The professor replied with icy calm, showing the official stamps from the lab, the credentials of the technicians who performed the analyses. He said he could sue Thomas for defamation if he continued with those baseless accusations. The crowd began to disperse, confused and frustrated. The court hearing would happen regardless, but now there was concrete data to present. Sarah remained seated on the ground, trembling from emotional exhaustion. Mrs. Hattie sat down beside her, and the two women stayed there in silence as the sun set over the canyon. That night, Daniel Brooks worked until dawn, incorporating the new analyses into the defense. Julian Sterling, the environmental lawyer, arrived from Chicago bringing legal precedents from similar cases in other regions. They built a solid argument. The preservation of the artesian aquifer was of greater public interest than risky exploratory drilling. The hearing took place in a small room at the courthouse, but half the town tried to get in to watch. The judge had to limit the number of spectators. Sarah sat at the table beside her lawyers, feeling every eye upon her. On the other side, Thomas and Sterling were flanked by an expensive lawyer from Chicago, hired in a hurry. The judge, a middle-aged man with a weary expression, asked the party who filed the court order to present their arguments first. The cousin's lawyer spoke eloquently about the water crisis, the community's suffering, and unproductive land that could save lives if used properly. Then it was Julian Sterling's turn. The environmental lawyer presented the geological analyses, explained the risks of improper drilling, cited laws protecting natural water resources. He showed photographs of the damp fissures, played the recording of the sound of running water. He called Arthur Sterling as an expert witness. The professor testified for nearly an hour, explaining in detailed yet accessible technical terms what he had found. The judge asked pertinent questions, clearly interested. When he asked if well-planned drilling might be possible in the future, Arthur answered yes, but it would require detailed studies of at least 6 months and specialized equipment. 6 months. The word echoed through the room. Thomas rose from his chair and shouted that in 6 months everyone would be dead of thirst. The judge banged his gavel and told him to sit down and behave. The tension in the room was palpable. Daniel Brooks then called Mrs. Hattie to testify. The elderly woman climbed to the stand with difficulty, but with dignity. She spoke about knowing Sarah Miller since she was a child, about the character of the late Uncle Silas, and about the importance of protecting natural resources for future generations. Her trembling but firm voice touched even the most cynical people in the room. The judge called for a recess to review the documents. Everyone went out into the hallway. Sarah leaned against the wall, closing her eyes. She felt like she was going to vomit from nervousness. Daniel brought her a glass of water, which she drank in small sips. When they returned, the judge had a grave expression. He read his decision aloud and formally. Considering the evidence presented about the artesian aquifer and the proven risks of irreversible environmental damage, he suspended the previous court order. Sarah Miller's lands would remain untouched until complete environmental studies were conducted. More than that, he declared that area as one of special environmental interest, subject to legal protection. The decision was like a bomb. Half the room erupted in protests, the other half in applause. Thomas Miller punched the table and stormed out. Sterling followed him, red with anger. Sarah could hardly believe it. She had won, at least for now. But the legal victory brought severe consequences. The town became even more divided. Those who supported the drilling saw Sarah as a direct enemy. Open boycotts began. Shopkeepers refused to sell to her. The butcher threw her out of his establishment. Children threw stones when she passed on the street. The situation in the valley continued to be desperate. Without rain and without the river, people depended more and more on expensive water trucks. Fights began to break out in the water distribution lines. One afternoon, two neighbors almost killed each other over a few gallons. The community was falling apart. Sarah lived secluded in the small room she had managed to rent in the back of a widow's house who didn't care about the rumors. She only went out for essentials. She received anonymous threats by phone. Someone painted swear words on her door. She lived in constant fear. It was Arthur Sterling who brought the news that would change everything. He had secured funding from an international environmental foundation to conduct the complete studies of the artesian aquifer. The foundation had become interested in the case after Julian Sterling shared the story. They wanted to turn it into a model for preserving natural water resources. The funding would cover not only the studies, but also the development of a sustainable water catchment system. Engineers would come from Chicago. Specialized equipment would be brought in, and Sarah, as the legal landowner, would be the project administrator. She would receive a salary for the work. The news brought immense relief, but also new fear. Now the project was real, concrete. What if it failed? What if after all the studies they discovered there wasn't enough water? What if the engineers made mistakes? The responsibility was overwhelming. The following months were intense. Teams of geologists, hydrologists, and engineers occupied the canyon. They set up a temporary camp. They drilled test wells in specific locations, determined by seismic and ground-penetrating radar studies. Each drilling was carefully monitored. Sarah followed everything closely, learning about geology, hydrology, environmental engineering. The specialists treated her with respect, impressed by her practical knowledge of the land. She showed them where she had seen resilient plants, where she had heard running water. Her observations helped direct the studies. Meanwhile, the drought in the valley reached its worst point. Almost a year without significant rain. The shallow groundwater reserves were completely exhausted. Families began to abandon their properties, migrating to other regions. The town's population was shrinking. Businesses were closing. Thomas Miller lost half of his herd. He had to sell tractors and equipment to pay debts. The farm he had inherited, once prosperous, turned into dry, unproductive land. Sterling also faced terrible difficulties. His crops had failed 3 seasons in a row. The bank was threatening to foreclose on the mortgage. The irony did not go unnoticed. Those who had inherited the good land were going bankrupt, while Sarah, with the bad land, had a sustainable project in development. But she took no pleasure in others' suffering. She saw families she'd known since childhood losing everything, children thirsty, the elderly falling ill. It was then that Arthur presented the preliminary results of the studies. The artesian aquifer was even larger than they had imagined. It stretched for square miles beneath the canyon, fed by springs in distant mountains. The water was pure, of exceptional quality, and the volume was enough to supply not just the town, but the entire region for decades if managed properly. The news should have been cause for celebration, but Sarah felt the weight of the decision that lay ahead. The engineers explained they could install a collection system that would distribute water to the entire valley. But she would have to decide to give the water away for free, sell it at fair prices, or create some kind of mixed system. The choice would define everyone's future. Daniel Brooks, who had become not just a lawyer but a friend, advised caution. He said she had legal rights to that water, that she could charge and become rich. Arthur, on the other hand, reminded her that Uncle Silas had chosen her precisely because he trusted she would do the right thing, not the profitable thing. Sarah spent sleepless nights thinking. She remembered the humiliations, the stones thrown at her window, the threats. She remembered her brother trying to drag her off the rocks by force. Part of her wanted revenge, wanted to make everyone pay dearly for the water they so desperately needed. But another part, the part Uncle Silas had recognized in her, knew that would be a betrayal of everything she stood for. She made her decision on a clear morning. She met with the engineers, with Arthur, with Julian Sterling. She said she wanted to create a mixed system, free water for basic household use by families, especially the poorest. Water at cost for small farmers who practice sustainable agriculture. And commercial rates for large properties and industrial activities, with the revenue reinvested in maintaining the system. The lawyers drafted a detailed statute. They created a non-profit foundation to manage the water resource. Sarah would be the president, but there would be a board with community representatives. Everything transparent, everything monitored, everything sustainable. When the project was presented at a public meeting, the reaction was mixed. The poorest wept with relief. The small farmers thanked her emotionally, but the large landowners, including Thomas and Sterling, were outraged by the rates. They thought it was unfair to pay when others received it for free. Sarah faced the criticism with a calm she didn't know she possessed. She explained it wasn't about fairness or unfairness, but about sustainability, that the artesian aquifer was finite, that it needed protection, that those who consumed more should contribute more, that it wasn't revenge, it was responsibility. The first water from the system reached the valley 6 months later. Sarah personally opened the first tap, and a stream of crystal-clear liquid gushed out. People crowded around, filling buckets, bottles, drinking straight from the source. Many were crying. It was clean, fresh, abundant water. After nearly 2 years of cruel drought, it seemed like a miracle. In the following months, the valley slowly came back to life. Families who had left began to return. Farmers planted again. Cattle grazed in fields that received controlled irrigation. Businesses reopened. The town was rising from the ashes. But something had fundamentally changed. The community was no longer the same. The crisis had revealed the best and the worst in people. Some friendships grew stronger, others were broken forever. Sarah Miller continued to be viewed with resentment by some, but with growing gratitude by others. Thomas Miller never properly apologized. He showed up once at the foundation to pay for the water for his farm. He looked at his sister with a complex expression, a mix of shame and wounded pride. Sarah treated him with cold professionalism. There was no easy forgiveness for the brutalities she had suffered. Sterling had more difficulty accepting the new reality. His debts were too great. Even with water available, he lacked the resources to restart his crops. He ended up selling part of his inherited land to pay his creditors. The irony was bitter. The fertile lands of the valley were now worth less than the rocks of the canyon he had so despised. 1 year after the water distribution began, the canyon had transformed. It was no longer just a place of barren stones. It now housed the collection center, a small foundation office, and ecological trails. Arthur Sterling, with university support, had established a permanent research station there. Sarah managed everything with the help of a small team. She received a fair salary, nothing extravagant, but enough to live with dignity. She had rented a small but comfortable house. She had bought a used car that worked. For the first time in her adult life, she had financial stability. More important than the money was the purpose. She woke each morning knowing her work mattered, that families had clean water because of her decisions, that children were growing up healthy, that the valley was flourishing again. Uncle Silas would be proud. Mrs. Hattie had become a frequent visitor to the canyon. Even at her advanced age, she climbed the improved trail at least once a month. She would sit on the rocks beside Sarah, and they would talk about life, about choices, about losses and gains. The friendship between the elderly woman and the younger woman had deepened, teaching both valuable lessons. It was during one of these conversations that Mrs. Hattie mentioned something interesting. She said she had known Uncle Silas much better than Sarah imagined, that decades ago, when she was young, she had helped the uncle on a secret mission. He had discovered the underground water and wanted to protect it, but faced resistance from the family of that time. He ended up keeping the secret, waiting for the right person to reveal it. The revelation moved Sarah deeply. The uncle had planned everything decades in advance. He had chosen those lands specifically because he knew of their hidden value. And he had chosen Sarah as his heir because he saw in her the strength and integrity needed to protect the resource. It wasn't chance or cruelty. It was trust. Mrs. Hattie gave Sarah a final letter from her uncle, which she had kept for years waiting for the right moment. The letter was yellowed, written in a shaky but recognizable handwriting. Sarah opened it with trembling hands. The uncle wrote about his life, about regrets and hopes. He said the family had always been greedy, concerned only with visible and immediate wealth, that he needed someone different to protect something precious, that he had chosen Sarah because he saw in her the same purity he saw in the water hidden in the rocks, valuable precisely because it was protected from the world's contaminations. The letter ended by asking forgiveness for the ordeal he knew he would impose on Sarah. But it said he trusted she would emerge stronger, just as water emerges from rocks after millennia of pressure. That true value is never on the surface, but in the depths, where only the brave dare to look. Sarah cried reading those words. She cried for the first time not from pain or frustration, but from understanding and gratitude. The uncle had known her better than she knew herself. She turned potential, where everyone saw only fragility. He had given her not an inheritance of land, but an opportunity to prove her worth. In the following years, the Canyon Project became a national model for sustainable water resource management. Researchers came from other regions to study the system. Sarah gave lectures at universities, sharing her experience. The girl humiliated for inheriting rocks had become a reference in environmental conservation. But fame was never what mattered. What mattered were the children who now played near the water without fear of thirst. The farmers who planted with renewed hope. The elderly who lived their final years without the terror of scarcity. Every time she turned on a faucet and saw clean water gush out, Sarah remembered why she had fought. The canyon had also changed physically. With water available in a controlled manner, vegetation began to grow in areas that were once completely arid. Small gardens were planted around the collection center. Native trees found moist soil to take root. The place that had been a symbol of sterility became an oasis of life. Families began visiting the canyon on weekends. Educational trails were created, explaining the local geology, the importance of preservation, the history of the water discovery. Children learned about the hydrological cycle, walking the same rocks where Sarah had cried alone years before. The place gained new meaning. Sarah established an educational program in partnership with schools in the region. Teachers brought students for practical lessons about the environment. The young people planted seedlings, learned about water conservation, heard the story of how despised rocks had revealed themselves as treasure. Many said those visits changed their perspectives on value and appearances. Mrs. Hattie, now very elderly, insisted on participating in some of these lessons. She would sit in a chair brought especially for her and tell the children about the importance of seeing beyond the obvious, about how hasty judgments can hide deep truths. Her trembling but wise voice enchanted the little ones. As for Sarah's family, the years brought complex changes. Thomas eventually offered proper apologies. It wasn't easy for him to swallow his pride, but he did it. He acknowledged he had treated his sister with unjustified cruelty. He asked not for immediate forgiveness, but for a chance to rebuild some relationship. Sarah tentatively accepted, establishing clear boundaries. Sterling took longer to come speak with her. When he finally appeared, he was unrecognizable. He had aged 10 years in 3. He had lost almost everything. The farm, his pride, his arrogance. He asked not for free water, not for favors, just for work. Sarah hired him for general services at the foundation, not out of pity but because she believed in second chances. Seeing her once so arrogant cousin cleaning gutters and mowing grass was strange, but Sterling worked with silent dedication. Over time, he proved himself competent and reliable. Sarah promoted him gradually. They never became close again, but they built mutual professional respect. Her sister-in-law Brenda, who had mocked Sarah so much, also faced her own trials. Her husband left her for another woman, taking a large portion of the couple's resources. She was left with 2 small children and few job skills. She appeared ashamed, asking for a job at the foundation. Sarah hesitated, the cruel words still echoing in her memory. But she hired Brenda for administrative services, deciding that breaking the cycle of cruelty began with herself. Victoria, the cousin who had inherited the farm with the big house, was the last to seek Sarah out. Her farm had also suffered greatly from the drought, but had managed to recover with water from the system. She came not to ask for a job, but to offer something unexpected: apologies and friendship. The two talked for hours, cried together, exorcised old grievances. Gradually, Sarah rebuilt family ties on her own terms. She was no longer the poor, despised relative. She was a respected, capable woman, successful on her own merits. The family dynamic had completely changed. Now she was the one setting boundaries, deciding the acceptable level of closeness. Daniel Brooks, the young lawyer who had believed in her when no one else did, became a partner at a larger firm in Chicago. But he continued to provide pro bono legal counsel to the foundation. He visited the canyon regularly, not just for business, but out of genuine friendship. He and Sarah developed a deep connection based on mutual respect and shared experiences. Arthur Sterling, the geologist who had been fundamental to everything, continued his research in the canyon. He published several scientific articles about the unique geological formation. He won academic awards for his conservation work. But he said his greatest satisfaction was seeing the project working, helping real people. At 78, he still hiked up to the canyon weekly, now more slowly but with the same enthusiasm as always. Julian Sterling, the environmental lawyer, used the case as a precedent in other legal battles across the country. He helped communities protect their natural resources from predatory exploitation. He often invited Sarah to give testimonies in similar lawsuits. She discovered she had a talent for explaining complex issues in an accessible way. The foundation grew beyond initial expectations. It began to manage not only the canyon's water, but reforestation projects in the region. It established nurseries for native seedlings. It created mobile environmental education programs. It directly employed 15 people and indirectly benefited hundreds of families. Sarah, who had spent years living on odd jobs and uncertainty, now had a clear purpose and stability. But prosperity didn't change her essence. She continued to live simply, driving used cars, wearing practical clothes. She invested almost all her excess salary back into the foundation. Material wealth had never been her goal. What had changed profoundly was her self-esteem. The timid woman who lowered her head when family members humiliated her had disappeared. In her place, a confident leader had emerged, capable of making tough decisions, facing criticism, and defending her convictions. Suffering had tempered her as fire tempers steel. 5 years after inheriting the land, Sarah stood at the highest point of the canyon watching the sunset. The rocks that once seemed dead and useless now pulsed with life. She heard the murmur of water flowing in the collection systems. She saw trees swaying in the breeze. She watched birds that had returned to the region with the ecosystem's revitalization. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now continuing. Mrs. Hattie passed away peacefully in her sleep shortly after turning 87. Sarah was by her friend's side in the final weeks. The elderly woman said she could depart in peace, knowing that Uncle Silas's legacy was in good hands. She only asked that Sarah continue to be the guardian, not just of the water but of the values that water represented: transparency, sustainability, generosity. Mrs. Hattie's funeral brought together the entire town. Sarah gave the eulogy, speaking about courage, about the willingness to stand up for what is right even when it's unpopular. Many cried. Some remembered how they had treated Sarah years before and felt retrospective shame. The elder, who had changed sides when no one else dared, was an example of integrity to the end. Mrs. Hattie's death left a deep void, but also an important legacy. Before passing, the lady had established a scholarship in her will for young people from the region who wanted to study environmental sciences. The first beneficiary was a boy from a poor family who had always shown interest in the foundation's work. Sarah Miller personally supervised his academic development. The Canyon project began to attract international attention. A European scientific journal published an article about the case as a model for community-managed water resources. Researchers from Africa came to study the system to replicate it in their arid regions. Sarah found herself giving interviews in translated English, something she never imagined doing. The fame brought opportunities but also pressures. Companies wanted to buy water rights. Politicians wanted to associate themselves with the project to gain votes. Sarah had to learn to navigate these murky waters while maintaining the integrity of the original purpose. Daniel helped her with the legal aspects, establishing safeguards against commercial or political co-option. An unexpected challenge arose when a mining company discovered that the same geological formations in the canyon likely contained valuable mineral deposits deep underground. They offered obscene amounts for exploration rights. Sarah refused immediately, but the company persisted. They threatened lawsuits, claiming she couldn't impede national economic development. The legal battle lasted 2 years. Julian Sterling coordinated the defense, arguing that protecting the water source took precedence over potential mineral exploitation. They gathered expert reports showing that mining drilling would irreversibly compromise the artesian aquifer. The case reached higher courts. During this stressful period, Sarah faced public attacks again. Some accused her of selfishness, of blocking progress and jobs. Right-wing newspapers painted her as an environmental radical. Left-wing newspapers defended her as an ecological heroine. She was neither, just a woman trying to protect what her uncle had entrusted to her. The final court ruling favored the foundation. The magistrates recognized that water resources take priority over mineral exploitation when there is a direct conflict. They established important legal precedent. The mining company appealed, lost again, and finally gave up. Sarah had won, but the fight left scars of stress and exhaustion. It was during this period that she met someone important. Samuel was an environmental engineer hired to maintain the catchment systems. He was 38, had a calm manner, and a genuine passion for conservation. They worked together for months before Sarah realized she was looking for reasons to talk to him beyond professional needs. The romance was slow and careful. Sarah had emotional walls built from years of family rejection and betrayal. Samuel was patient, respectful, genuinely interested in her as a person, not as the famous woman from the Canyon project. There were walks through the canyon, simple dinners, long conversations about dreams and fears that gradually brought them closer. When they finally kissed under the stars at the highest point of the canyon, Sarah felt something she didn't know was possible: emotional safety. Someone saw her completely with all her wounds and strengths and chose to stay. Not out of interest, not out of obligation, but out of genuine love. The relationship was tested when Samuel received a lucrative job offer in another city. He could earn 3 times more at a private company. Sarah said she wouldn't hold him back, that he should do what was best for his career. Samuel thought for weeks, then declined the offer. He said money couldn't buy purpose, and the work in the canyon gave him something no salary could: the satisfaction of making a real difference. They married 2 years later, in a simple ceremony in the canyon itself. Professor Arthur officiated the informal union before the legal ceremony at the courthouse. Guests included foundation workers, farmers who benefited from the water, partner researchers, and selected family members. Thomas Miller attended, deeply moved. Sterling served as his best man, a gesture of reconciliation that meant a great deal. Married life brought a new dimension to Sarah's existence. Having a partner who shared her values and purpose was a gift she never expected to receive. Samuel integrated completely into the Foundation's work, bringing new ideas to improve system efficiency. Together, they were a formidable team. They had a daughter 3 years after the wedding. They named her Sylvia in honor of the uncle who started it all. The girl grew up playing among the rocks of the canyon, drinking the purest water, learning from an early age about responsibility and preservation. Sarah saw in her the third generation of guardians for that special place. Arthur Sterling passed away at 84, working until his last week. His final project was to catalogue all the plant species that had returned to the canyon with the availability of water. The funeral was a celebration of a life well lived. Sarah gave a speech about how the professor had believed in her when she had only hints and intuition, how his expertise gave scientific credibility to what could have been dismissed as a pipe dream. Arthur's death marked the end of an era, but also continuity. He had left trained successors, established protocols, documented knowledge. The research outpost in the canyon was renamed in his honor. University students continued to visit for studies, keeping alive the tradition of rigorous scientific investigation. 10 years after inheriting the land, Sarah was invited to give a lecture at an international conference on water resource management. She flew for the first time in her life to another country. The experience was simultaneously terrifying and thrilling. She presented the canyon case to an audience of world experts. She received a standing ovation at the end. Reporters wanted to know the secret of her success. Sarah answered honestly, "There was no secret, just hard work, respect for nature, and a refusal to choose profit over sustainability." Some seemed disappointed with such a simple answer. They wanted a magic formula, not basic principles of integrity and dedication. Back in the US, Sarah realized how much her world had expanded. From a substitute teacher with no prospects, she had become an internationally recognized leader. But the canyon remained home. The rocks that had welcomed her at her worst moment remained her anchor. No matter how far she traveled, she always returned to that place. The Foundation prospered, but Sarah never forgot the first principles: free water for basic needs, fair prices for sustainable agriculture, commercial rates for large consumers, total transparency in finances, community participation in decisions. The model worked because it wasn't based on greed, but on balance. Other communities began to replicate the model. Sarah traveled across the country, helping local groups identify and protect their own natural water resources. Each community had unique challenges, but the principles applied universally. She saw in this work an expansion of Uncle Silas's legacy. Thomas, who had rebuilt his life after losing so much, became an unexpected ally. He used his smaller farm to demonstrate sustainable agriculture techniques with responsible irrigation. He gave talks to other farmers about how he had adapted his practices. The relationship between siblings never became close again, but they found mutual respect based on personal growth. Sterling, after years working at the Foundation, saved enough to buy a small piece of land. He grew organics using techniques he learned at the canyon. He sold at local farmers' markets. The fall and reconstruction transformed him. The arrogant man who had mocked Sarah had become a humble worker, grateful for every opportunity. Victoria remained the closest cousin. Her daughters grew up admiring Aunt Sarah as a model of strength and determination. When the eldest decided to study environmental biology, Victoria attributed it to Sarah's influence. The new generation was growing up with values different from those that had dominated the family for so long. 15 years after inheriting the land, Sarah was 47. She looked at old photos from when she received the property deed, the frightened 32-year-old woman who cried alone on the rocks. She barely recognized that person. The suffering had transformed her, not broken her. Her daughter Sylvia was 12 and already showed a passion for geology, like the great-uncle she never knew. She spent hours exploring rock formations, asking complex questions that even challenged researchers. Sarah saw in her the continuation of the mission. When the time came, there would be someone prepared to take on the protection of that land. Samuel remained a constant companion. Together, they expanded the Foundation's work to include solar energy and reforestation projects. The canyon had become a center for sustainability innovation. Students from all over the world came to intern, learn, and contribute. The isolated place had become a convergence point for brilliant minds dedicated to environmental solutions. The town that once scorned Sarah now celebrated her. Streets were named after the project. A school was named the Silas Miller Educational Center. The current mayor, elected on an environmental platform, credited the town's cultural shift to Sarah's example. She accepted the praise with modesty, knowing power could easily corrupt. But not everything was triumph. Challenges kept appearing. Climate change made the work more complex. Rainfall patterns changed. They constantly needed to adapt conservation strategies. Sarah had gone from solving a problem to navigating constantly evolving problems. She had learned that environmental conservation has no finish line, only continuity. Daniel Brooks, now a senior partner at a respected firm, still advised the foundation for free. Their friendship had withstood time. He had become a father figure to Sylvia, teaching the girl about justice and the importance of defending the right causes. Sarah was grateful to have loyal people in her life, something she couldn't take for granted. Uncle Silas's letters remained kept in a special box. Sarah reread them occasionally, always finding new layers of meaning. Her uncle had seen in her something she herself did not see. He had bet everything on her ability to protect what was precious. His confidence had sustained her in the darkest moments. There was a time when Sarah hated her uncle for putting her in that position, for making her a target of humiliation and hatred. Now she understood it wasn't cruelty, but deep love. He could have left the land to environmental organizations, to the government, to institutions, but he chose to leave it to her because he believed only someone with a deep personal connection would protect it properly. And he was right. Sarah had defended that land with a ferocity no institution would have, because it wasn't just about water or ecology. It was about honoring someone who believed in her when no one else did. It was about proving to herself that she had worth. It was about transforming scorned stones into a source of life. The canyon at dusk was of indescribable beauty. The rocks that absorbed heat all day released it gradually, creating air currents that made the newly established plants dance. Birds returned to nests in crevices that were once just dry stone. Dragonflies circled over small lakes, formed by controlled excess irrigation. Sarah walked the trails she helped create, greeting staff who were closing the area for the day. She knew each by name, their stories, their families. The foundation employed children of people who hated her years ago. She ensured everyone received fair wages, proper benefits, consistent respect. Samuel found her at the highest point, where they always went at the end of the day. They sat side by side on the smooth rock, warmed by the sun. Sylvia Miller ran ahead, exploring with the boundless energy of a child. The couple watched in comfortable silence, appreciating the peace they had built together. In that moment, Sarah Miller allowed herself to feel pride. Not arrogant pride, but the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. She had transformed the worst thing that ever happened to her into the best. She had taken the humiliation and turned it into purpose. She had taken the rejected stones and revealed the hidden treasure. But she knew the story didn't end there. Each day brought new challenges, new decisions, new tests of character. The water would keep flowing as long as it was properly protected, and she would keep being its guardian as long as she had strength. After her, Sylvia Miller would take over, and after Sylvia Miller, another generation. The commitment transcended individuals. The sun finally set completely, staining the sky with dramatic purples and oranges. Stars began to appear, one by one, until they filled the celestial dome. In the canyon, far from the city's light pollution, the Milky Way revealed itself in full splendor. Sarah Miller looked up, feeling simultaneously tiny and significant. 20 years after inheriting the land, the foundation celebrated its anniversary with a grand festival. Thousands attended. There was music, food, educational exhibits. Children played in designated areas, while adults watched presentations about conservation. The event attracted national attention. Sarah Miller gave an emotional speech. She spoke about Uncle Silas, about Mrs. Hattie, about Arthur Sterling, about everyone who supported her when it was unpopular. She even thanked those who had attacked her because adversity had strengthened her determination. Some people in the audience cried, remembering how they had treated her and feeling genuine remorse. The festival ended with the release of sustainable lanterns that rose into the night sky like earthly stars. Each lantern represented hope, renewal, continued life. Sarah Miller released hers alongside Samuel and Sylvia Miller, offering silent thanks to the uncle who started it all. In the years that followed, the project matured even further. It became financially self-sufficient. It generated enough revenue from commercial users to cover all operational costs and still invest in improvements. Sarah Miller was able to gradually reduce her direct workload. She began mentoring young environmental leaders. She shared hard-learned lessons, strategies that worked, mistakes to avoid. She saw mentoring as a way to multiply her impact. Each person she helped would influence dozens of others. The legacy expanded exponentially. Sylvia Miller, now 20 years old, studied geology at the country's best university. She came home on holidays and worked at the foundation, absorbing practical knowledge that complemented academic theory. She had a serious boyfriend, a young man studying civil engineering with a focus on sustainable infrastructure. Sarah Miller saw in them the potential to continue the work for another generation. Thomas Miller passed away at 68 from a sudden heart attack. In his final years, he had genuinely reconciled with Sarah Miller. He left a letter asking to be cremated and have his ashes scattered in the canyon. He said he wanted to rest eternally in the place that had revealed his worst and best self. Sarah Miller honored the request, crying for the complexity of family relationships, for lost opportunities, but also for possible redemption. Sterling, surprisingly, lived much longer. At 75, he still worked part-time at the foundation, now more as a wise grandfather than an employee. He told visitors stories about what the place was like before, how they had scorned that land, how he regretted judging without understanding. Her stories became part of the educational tour. Victoria developed Alzheimer's in her 60s. Sarah Miller ensured she received the best care, paying part of the medical expenses. She visited her cousin regularly, even when she no longer recognized her. During the visits, she spoke about old times, about happy childhood moments, about forgiveness and reconciliation. She didn't know if Victoria understood, but the words needed to be said. Samuel retired at 65. He began dedicating himself full-time to his photography hobby, documenting the ongoing transformation of the canyon. His photos illustrated textbooks, scientific magazines, calendars. They captured not only the physical beauty of the place, but its spiritual essence, the sense of purpose that emanated from the rocks. Sarah, now 62, remained active but at a slower pace. The grey hair she let grow naturally was tied in a practical ponytail. Wrinkles marked her face, each one telling a story of a difficult decision, a sleepless night of joyful laughter. She wore them with pride, battles won etched into her skin. The foundation now employed 40 people directly. It maintained partnerships with a dozen universities. It published meticulous annual reports on the state of the artesian aquifer, ensuring complete transparency. External auditors validated the finances. Everything was done as correctly as possible, setting a standard of excellence. Sarah wrote her memoirs in her spare time, not out of vanity, but because stories teach. She wanted to document exactly how it had been, the difficulties, the choices, the consequences, so that future generations would understand that meaningful achievements rarely come easy, that standing up for what's right often means standing alone, that it's worth it. The manuscript grew slowly. Samuel encouraged her, saying the story needed to be told completely, without embellishments. Daniel offered to help with the legal aspects of publication. Sylvia Miller said she would illustrate the book with geological maps and diagrams. It would be a family project, just as the foundation itself had become. Visitors to the canyon often asked Sarah if she had any regrets. She thought carefully before answering. Honestly, she regretted the years lost to hatred toward her family, the relationships that could have been mended sooner if pride hadn't gotten in the way. But she did not regret defending those lands. She would never regret that. The drought that started it all became just a distant memory. The rains returned to normal patterns years ago, but no one forgot. The collective trauma of that period had marked the community deeply. It transformed values. People now conserved water even in times of plenty. They planted with long-term sustainability in mind. The crisis had taught permanent lessons. The canyon was no longer just a water source. It had become a symbol. It represented the possibility of transformation. It proved that what seems worthless can have profound meaning, that perseverance overcomes obstacles, that courageous individual choices can benefit entire communities. Schools used the story as a teaching tool about ethics and the environment. Sarah gave occasional lectures to students. She always started with the same question: what would you consider a bad inheritance? The answers varied: debts, unproductive land, unwanted responsibilities. Then she would tell her story, showing how even seemingly bad inheritances can be gifts in disguise. A young student approached her after a lecture. She said she was going through a similar situation, not with land, but with a failed family business she had inherited from her father. Everyone told her to declare bankruptcy and move on, but she felt she should try to save it. She asked for advice. Sarah talked at length with the girl. She said she couldn't tell her what to do, each situation was unique. But she shared her experience, the value of trusting intuition, seeking specialized knowledge, not giving up easily, but also recognizing when something is truly beyond saving. The student left with eyes shining with renewed determination. Months later, Sarah received a letter from the same girl. She had managed to restructure the business with help from mentors. It wouldn't be quick or easy, but there was a way. She thanked Sarah for showing that problems can be disguised opportunities. The letter moved Sarah deeply. Her impact extended in ways she had never imagined. As she aged, Sarah thought more about death, not with fear, but with pragmatic curiosity. When she departed, everything would be in order. The foundation had a solid governance structure. Sylvia was prepared to assume leadership eventually. Trusted lawyers would protect the legacy. She could depart in peace, knowing the work would continue. But it was not yet time. There was much to do, a book to finish, Sylvia to train completely, new projects to start. At 65, she planned to work at least another 10 years. The vitality she inherited from her mother, her grandmother, from generations of strong women, still ran vigorous in her veins. The canyon at dawn was especially beautiful. Sarah began taking daily morning walks, observing how the first golden light touched the rocks. She saw places where water now naturally surfaced, small springs that careful studies had allowed to appear without compromising the main aquifer. The land responded to proper care. They installed solar panels that powered the entire operation with renewable energy. They planted more than 10,000 native trees in the last decade. They reintroduced animal species that had disappeared from the region. The canyon had ceased to be just a water source. It had become a complete ecological sanctuary. Sustainable tourism brought additional revenue. Small controlled groups could visit for a fee that funded conservation. Trained guides explained the history, the geology, the importance of preservation. Visitors left transformed, many saying the place had an almost sacred quality. Sarah laughed at the idea of sacred applied to rocks and water, but she understood the feeling. There was something special there, not supernatural, but profoundly real. It was the presence of life where it once seemed impossible. It was the physical manifestation of what commitment and care could achieve. It was tangible hope. On her 67th birthday, they organized a surprise celebration at the canyon. Hundreds attended. Current and retired staff, research partners, benefited farmers, students who had interned, family, friends. Samuel organized everything secretly with Sylvia's help. Emotional speeches were made. Daniel Brooks, now with graying hair but the same enthusiasm as ever, recalled the day he met Sarah, scared and desperate. Arthur Sterling Jr., son of the late geologist who followed in his father's footsteps, spoke about how the partnership between his family and Sarah had changed lives. Sterling, with a broken voice, offered public apologies for past mistakes and thanked her for the opportunity for redemption. Sarah responded to everyone with gratitude. She said she did nothing alone. that every person present had contributed in some way, that the project belonged to everyone, that the legacy was shared. The words were not just courtesy, they were deep truth. Alone, she would have failed. Together, they turned stones into an oasis. The party continued late into the night. Live music, plentiful food, dancing under the stars. Children ran laughing among the rocks. Elders sat in comfortable chairs exchanging stories. It was a community gathered not by crisis, but by celebration. It was the world Sarah had helped create. Sitting in her favorite spot with Samuel by her side, watching the celebration, Sarah reflected on the journey. From solitary tears on those same rocks decades ago to today's joyful laughter. From crushing humiliation to hard-earned respect. From hopeless despair to purpose rich with meaning. She thought of Uncle Silas and whispered thanks he could not hear, but she needed to express. She thanked him for the trust, for the belief that she would overcome trials, for seeing strengths in her she herself did not know, for leaving a legacy that seemed like cruelty, but was deep love. The rocks beneath her hands were warm from the day's accumulated heat, the same rocks everyone scorned, the same rocks that held liquid treasure in their depths, the same rocks that transformed her from victim to leader. She caressed them with affection, a physical connection to the purpose that had defined her life. The original deed, that document she held with trembling hands in the humiliation of the lawyer's office, was now framed in the Foundation's office. Sarah Miller looked at it often, remembering where she began. 13 acres of rock in the canyon, the words that provoked cruel laughter, the words that changed everything. Sylvia Miller approached with exciting news. Her master's thesis on the canyon's geological formation had been accepted for publication in a prestigious international journal. The new generation continued the tradition of rigorous research, started by Arthur Sterling. Knowledge accumulated, protecting the place through deep scientific understanding. Samuel commented they should plan a special trip to celebrate 40 years since Sarah inherited the land. She liked the idea. Perhaps they would return to the original lawyer's office, now the town's historical museum. Perhaps visit Uncle Silas's grave, which she rarely visited but always remembered. Perhaps simply stay in the canyon, his true memorial. The canyon would continue after Sarah was gone. It would continue after Sylvia. It would continue after all who worked there. Rocks exist on geological timescales. Water has flowed for millennia and will flow for millennia more. Humans are merely temporary guardians, but what they do during their watch matters profoundly. Sarah had ensured her watch mattered. She transformed scorn into dignity. She transformed stones into purpose. She transformed humiliation into the quiet heroism that doesn't seek spotlights, but consistently changes lives. And in doing so, she proved that true value is rarely where superficial glances look. The water flowing from taps in homes throughout the valley was physical testimony to right choices. Every crystalline drop told a story of a woman who refused to give up, of a scientist who believed without complete proof, of a young lawyer who risked his reputation, of an elder who changed sides when being right mattered more than being popular, of all who chose principle over convenience. And then, in that perfect moment of celebration under a starry sky, with loved ones around and fulfilled purpose, tangible in every direction she looked, Sarah Miller allowed herself to feel something rare and precious, complete peace with the path traveled and quiet hope for the future to come. End of story. This was a fictional story created to touch our hearts. Now tell us what you thought of this journey of transformation and overcoming. Where are you joining us from? Do you believe Sarah made the right decisions in protecting this land? Share your sincere reflections in the comments. Thank you so much for your company in this story. Don't forget to leave your like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other exciting stories.